The Cold War did not begin with a declaration. There was no battlefield where soldiers lined up, no single gunshot that announced its arrival. It began quietly, in the silence that followed victory. In 1945, the world stood among ruins. Cities lay flattened, entire nations were exhausted, and more than 60 million lives had been erased by World War II. Europe was broken. Asia was scarred. Empires had collapsed. But from the ashes, two powers rose higher than all others: the United States and the Soviet Union. They had fought on the same side. They had defeated the same enemy. And yet, beneath the smiles and handshakes, something dangerous was growing: distrust. The Cold War was not born from hatred alone. It was born from fear. The world after the war, America emerged from World War II richer, stronger, and untouched at home. Its factories were intact. Its economy was booming. Its military power was unmatched. And it alone possessed the most terrifying weapon ever created: the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union emerged victorious, but shattered. 27 million Soviets were dead. Entire cities had been destroyed. Farms burned. Families erased. To Moscow, survival itself had come at an unimaginable cost. And survival shapes memory. Where America saw opportunity, the Soviet Union saw danger. Where America saw rebuilding, the Soviet Union remembered invasion. Twice in 30 years, Western Europe had been the pathway through which enemies marched into Russian land. Napoleon, Hitler, both times. Devastation followed. Stalin did not want friendship. He wanted security. And security, to him, meant control. Two visions for one world. Cold War was not just a political conflict. It was a battle between divisions of how humanity should live. The United States believed in capitalism, free markets, private ownership, democratic elections, individual freedom. To Americans, prosperity came from competition and choice. The Soviet Union believed in communism, state control, collective ownership, centralized power. To Soviets, capitalism meant exploitation, inequality, and endless cycles of war. Each side believed the other was not just wrong, but dangerous. If capitalism spread, communism would collapse. If communism spread, freedom would die. There was no room for coexistence, only expansion or containment. The conference that changed everything in early 1945, before the war had even ended, the leaders of the Allied powers met at Yalta: Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin. On paper, the meeting was about peace. In reality, it was about power. Europe would be divided into zones of influence. Germany would be split. Borders would be redrawn. Elections were promised. But the promises meant different things to different men. To America, elections meant freedom of choice. To Stalin, elections meant outcomes that favored Moscow. When Soviet troops liberated Eastern Europe, they did not leave. Governments loyal to the Kremlin replaced local leaders. Opposition voices disappeared. Newspapers fell silent. From Poland to Hungary, from Romania to East Germany, a new iron grip tightened. Churchill would later give it a name: the Iron Curtain. In 1946, Winston Churchill stood in Missouri and warned the world: from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that curtain, Eastern Europe was being sealed off politically, militarily, ideologically. To Americans, this looked like aggression. To Soviets, it looked like defense. And this misunderstanding became permanent. Each move was seen as proof of the other's worst intentions. The Truman Doctrine in Washington. Fear was spreading. What if communism did not stop in Eastern Europe? What if it reached Greece, Turkey, Italy, France? In 1947, President Harry Truman made a declaration that would shape the next 40 years. The United States would support any nation resisting communism, not through invasion, but through money, weapons, and influence. This policy became known as containment. The goal was simple: stop communism from spreading anywhere. The Cold War had found its strategy: the Marshall Plan, aid or weapon. Soon after, America announced the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid program to rebuild Europe. Billions of dollars were offered. Roads, factories, farms, cities would be restored. Western Europe accepted eagerly. Eastern Europe was forbidden. Stalin saw the plan not as generosity, but as economic warfare. To him, American money was a Trojan horse, a way to pull nations into Washington's orbit. He ordered Soviet-aligned countries to refuse the aid. Europe split not just by borders, but by recovery. West rebuilt. East stagnated. The divide deepened. Germany, the heart of the conflict. No hair was the Cold War more visible than in Germany. Berlin, deep inside Soviet territory, was divided into four zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. At first, cooperation held. Then it collapsed. In 1948, The Western Allies introduced a new currency to stabilize their zones. Stalin responded by cutting off all land access to West Berlin. The city was starving. The world waited. America had a choice: abandon Berlin or fight. Instead, it flew. For nearly a year, American and British planes delivered food, fuel, and supplies around the clock. One plane landed every few minutes. The Berlin airlift became a symbol, not of war but of resolve. Stalin backed down. Germany was soon split into two nations, and the Cold War turned permanent. Two blocks, one planet. By the late 1940s, the world was reorganizing. The United States led NATO, a military alliance promising collective defense. The Soviet Union responded with its own bloc, the Warsaw Pact. Peace was now protected by threat. Attack one, and all would respond. The balance was fragile, and it would soon become nuclear. The bomb changes everything. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. America's monopoly was over. The Cold War entered its most dangerous phase. Now, war did not mean victory. It meant annihilation. Both sides raced to build more powerful weapons: hydrogen bombs, missiles, submarines capable of ending civilization in minutes. This balance of terror had a name: mutually assured destruction, MAD. Peace was maintained not by trust, but by fear, a war without bullets. Yet no American and Soviet soldiers would officially fight each other directly, but the world became their battlefield. Every revolution, every civil war, every political crisis was now a test. Who would win the future? Communism or capitalism? The Cold War had begun, quietly, deeply, and without mercy, and it was only getting started. The Cold War was supposed to stay cold. That was the unspoken rule. No direct clash, no open battlefield between the superpowers. But history rarely follows rules. In 1950, on a narrow peninsula in East Asia, the Cold War turned hot for the first time. Korea was a country divided not by choice, but by convenience. When Japan surrendered at the end of World War II, Korea was split hurriedly along the 38th parallel. The North fell under Soviet influence. The South leaned toward the United States. At first, it was meant to be temporary. It never was. Two governments emerged, each claiming to be the only legitimate Korea. Tension grew, borders hardened, and then, without warning, North Korean troops crossed the line. The invasion was swift and brutal. For Washington, this was not just a regional conflict, it was a test. If communism could expand through force in Korea, where would it stop? The United States intervened under the banner of the United Nations. Troops landed, cities burned, millions fled. Then China entered the war. Suddenly, what began as a civil conflict became an international bloodbath. Waves of soldiers collided in freezing mountains and shattered villages. The front line moved north, then south, then north again. 3 years later, the war ended where it began, at the same border. No victory, no peace treaty, only an armistice. Korea remained divided, and the message was clear. The Cold War would be fought not in capitals, but in other people's countries. As soldiers fought abroad, fear grew at home. In America, the enemy was no longer just overseas. It was believed to be everywhere, in offices, in universities, in Hollywood. Even inside the government, Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to power not with evidence, but with accusations. He claimed communists had infiltrated the nation. Careers were destroyed, lives were ruined, loyalty was questioned, silence became safety, fear became policy. The Cold War had entered the minds of ordinary people. Children practiced duck and cover drills in classrooms. Families built bomb shelters. Newspapers speculated about nuclear annihilation. The idea that the world could end in minutes became normal. Meanwhile, the battlefield expanded. In 1949, China fell to communism under Mao Zedong. For the United States, this was a shock. A quarter of humanity now lived under a communist government. Asia was no longer distant. It was central. In Vietnam, French colonial rule collapsed. What followed was not independence, but division. North Vietnam aligned with the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam relied on American support. Once again, the pattern repeated. Two ideologies, one country, endless suffering. America sent advisors first, then weapons, then troops. What was meant to be containment became entanglement. The war dragged on. Jungles turned into graveyards. Villages were destroyed. Trust eroded. The enemy was invisible. The cost was unbearable. Back home, protests erupted. Students marched. Soldiers returned broken, physically and mentally. For the first time, America questioned itself. The Cold War was no longer just about power. It was about identity. While wars burned in Asia, another battlefield emerged far from the front lines. Space. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. It was small, silent, and deadly in its symbolism. If the Soviets could reach space, They could reach anywhere. Panic followed. America accelerated its programs. Schools emphasized science. Budgets exploded. Rockets rose. The space race was not about exploration. It was about dominance. Each launch was a message. Each failure was humiliation. When Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, the Soviet Union claimed triumph. When America landed on the moon, it reclaimed prestige. Above the Earth, the Cold War played out without bullets but with immense pressure. Then came the moment the world came closest to ending. In 1962, American spy planes discovered something terrifying in Cuba's Soviet nuclear missiles, just miles from U.S. shores. The response was immediate. A naval blockade, troops on alert, bombers ready. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Every decision carried extinction. One mistake, one miscommunication, one missile. Behind closed doors, diplomacy fought panic. Letters crossed oceans. Threats softened. Compromises were made. The missiles were removed. The war was avoided. But the lesson was burned into history. The Cold War was no longer theoretical. It was real. It was fragile. And it could end everything. After Cuba, something shifted. Direct confrontation became the dangerous. Instead, influence became the weapon. Africa, Latin America, the Middle East. Every revolution mattered. Every election mattered. Every coup mattered. Superpowers backed dictators, rebels, armies not because they were good, but because they were useful. The Cold War cared little for morality. Only alignment by the 1970s, exhaustion set in. Vietnam drained America's Soviet economy strained under military spending. Talks began. Treaties were signed. Nuclear limits were discussed. This period was called détente. It felt like relief, but beneath the surface, rivalry never died. It waited. The Cold War never truly relaxed. Even when leaders smiled for cameras and treaties were signed, suspicion lived underneath every handshake. Hatred was temporary, fear was permanent. In 1979, that fear returned to open conflict when Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan. Officially, it was described as assistance. A friendly government had asked for help, and officially, it was a warning. The Soviet Union was not retreating. It was still expanding influence where it could. But Afghanistan was different. The land was unforgiving. Mountains swallowed armies. Roads disappeared. Villages blended into terrain. Fighters melted away and returned when least expected. The United States saw opportunity. Weapons were sent quietly. Money flowed through shadows. Afghan resistance fighters were armed and trained, not to win quickly, but to bleed the Soviets slowly. It worked. The war dragged on for nearly a decade. Young Soviet soldiers came home in coffins. The cost crushed an already fragile economy. Morale collapsed. Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and the world took notice while the Soviet Union struggled abroad. America changed direction at home. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan entered the White House with a clear message. The Cold War was not over, and compromise was weakness. Called the Soviet Union an evil empire. Military spending surged. New missiles were developed. Space-based defense systems were announced. For a moment, it felt like the world was moving backward. Nuclear drills returned. Tensions rose. Europe protested missiles stationed on its soil. Fear resurfaced, sharper than before, but something unexpected happened. The Soviet system was cracking. Years of central control had suffocated innovation. Resources were misallocated. Corruption thrived. The people were tired not of ideology, but of scarcity. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power, he understood something his predecessors' ignored system could not survive unchanged. He introduced reforms: openness, restructuring, transparency. Censorship loosened. Debate emerged. Criticism surfaced. For the first time, the Soviet people could speak, and once people speak, they rarely stop. Across Eastern Europe, change spread like a quiet fear. Governments that once ruled through fear began to hesitate. Protests grew. Borders weakened. Then came the wall. Berlin Wall was more than concrete. It was the physical symbol of division. East and West, freedom and control, hope and restriction. In 1989, crowds gathered. Guards waited. Orders never came. The wall fell. People climbed. They broke it with hammers. Families reunited. Strangers cried together.
No missiles launched, no tanks rolled in. The Cold War, which had shaped generations, was ending not with explosions, but with people. Soon after, Eastern European governments collapsed one by one. Elections replaced appointments. Flags changed. Statues fell. Inside the Soviet Union, the pressure was unbearable. Republics demanded independence. The economy collapsed further. Authority dissolved. In 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. No final battle. No surrender ceremony. Just an announcement. A superpower vanished. The Cold War was over. Or so it seemed. The United States emerged as the sole global superpower. Victory was declared. Democracy and capitalism appeared triumphant. But the world the Cold War created did not disappear with it. Nuclear weapons remained. Borders drawn by rivalry stayed. Conflicts fueled by proxy never truly ended. Afghanistan was left shattered. Vietnam scarred generations. Korea remained divided. And millions who lived through the Cold War carried something invisible: fear. The knowledge that at any moment everything could end. The Cold War reshaped how nations think, how wars are fought, how power is measured. It proved that the greatest battles do not always use bullets. Sometimes they use ideas, pressure, patience. It showed that empires can collapse not from invasion but from exhaustion, and it left behind a warning. When fear becomes policy, humanity pays the price. The Cold War ended without a final shot, but its echoes are still with us, in the weapons we keep, in the alliances we trust, in the tensions that never fully disappear. History calls it cold, but for those who lived through it, there was nothing cold about it at all. The world moved on, but it did not move uncleanly. When the Cold War ended, many believed history itself had reached a conclusion. Democracy had won. Markets were open. Borders softened. There was talk of a peace dividend, a future where military budgets would shrink and cooperation would replace confrontation. For a brief moment, it felt possible. The United States stood alone at the top. Its military reached every ocean. Its culture spread through television, music, and technology. Former rivals sought partnership instead of resistance, but power never exists in a vacuum. The collapse of the Soviet Union left behind fractured states, wounded pride, and unanswered questions. Russia was no longer an empire, but it had not forgotten what it once was. Its economy collapsed in the 1990s. Ordinary people struggled. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. Stability vanished. To many Russians, the Cold War had not ended in peace. It had ended in humiliation. NATO expanded eastward, absorbing countries that had once been firmly inside the Soviet sphere. To the west, this was protection and choice. To Moscow, it looked like encirclement. Old fears resurfaced. Different names replaced old ones, but the language sounded familiar. Security, influence. Red lines. The Cold War had ended on paper, but its psychology survived. Elsewhere, the aftershocks were even more visible. In regions where superpowers once fought indirectly, the damage lingered. Governments collapsed. Weapons flooded black markets. Extremist groups filled the void left by retreating powers. Afghanistan, abandoned after the Soviet withdrawal, descended into chaos. The same networks once armed during the Cold War mutated into something new. A different kind of enemy emerged, one without a flag, a border, or a capital. On September 11, 2001, the United States was attacked on its own soil. The towers fell. The world watched in shock. The Cold War had shaped the conditions, even if it did not pull the trigger. The new century brought new conflicts, but old habits remained. Intervention. Alliances. Proxy struggles. Technology replaced ideology as the front line. Cyber warfare, information battles, economic pressure, surveillance. The weapons changed. The mindset did not. Nuclear arsenals still waited in silence. Treaties frayed, trust eroded. And once again, the world found itself divided, not always into two clear camps, but into competing visions of order. The Cold War's greatest legacy was not the wars it avoided. It was the world it created, a world where fear can prevent conflict but never erase it, where peace is maintained not by harmony but by balance, where power is measured not just by armies but by influence. It taught humanity how close it could come to destruction and how narrowly it could step back. Today, when tensions rise between great powers, the shadow of the Cold War returns. When missiles are tested, when alliances harden, when rhetoric sharpens, history whispers reminders. This has happened before. The Cold War was not a single chapter. It was a warning written across generations. And whether that warning is remembered or ignored will decide what kind of future comes next. The Cold War did not end with celebration in the streets of every nation. For many, it ended quietly, not with relief, but with uncertainty. History often marks its conclusions with dates: 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But lived experience is not so neat. For millions who grew up under the shadow of nuclear war, the fear did not simply vanish. It settled deep, becoming part of how the modern world thinks about power, security, and survival. The Cold War trained humanity to live with the unthinkable. For nearly half a century, the world existed in a permanent state of preparation for disaster. Governments planned for doomsday. Cities mapped evacuation routes. Children were taught that survival might depend on hiding beneath a desk. This constant awareness reshaped behavior. Leaders spoke carefully. Crises were managed through back channels and coded language. Silence became strategy. The Cold War proved that restraint could be as powerful as force, yet restraint came at a cost. Entire generations lived with anxiety as background noise. Creativity and progress existed alongside suspicion and censorship. Loyalty was tested. Dissent was punished. Truth was often sacrificed for stability. When the Cold War ended, many believed a new era had arrived, one guided by cooperation instead of confrontation. Borders opened. Markets merged. Technology connected people across continents. But the structures built during the Cold War did not dissolve overnight. Military alliances remained. Nuclear stockpiles stayed armed. Strategic thinking continued to revolve around deterrence and dominance. The language softened. The logic remained. In the decades that followed, echoes of the Cold War became harder to ignore. Former rivalries returned under new names. Old fears found modern justifications. Information replaced ideology as the primary battlefield. Influence became more subtle, but no less aggressive. Conflicts once explained as local were again viewed through global lenses. Power blocks re-emerged. Trust eroded. The Cold War had not been erased. It had evolved. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Cold War is not about weapons or wars. It is about limits. It revealed how far humanity could push itself toward destruction and how close it could come without crossing the final line. It demonstrated that fear can prevent catastrophe but cannot build peace. Peace requires something more difficult: understanding. The Cold War reminds us that victory is rarely absolute, that even when one side collapses, the consequences remain, that dominance without empathy breeds resentment, and that unresolved history never truly disappears. It waits. Today's world is faster, louder, and more connected than ever before. Decisions travel instantly. Misinformation spreads without borders. Technology magnifies mistakes. In such a world, the lessons of the Cold War matter more than ever, because the next global conflict may not announce itself with armies or declarations. It may arrive quietly, in systems, in networks, in silence. The Cold War was called cold because it never erupted into open global war. But for those who lived beneath its shadow, it was a constant fire, unseen, unending, and always close. And as long as power is feared and dominance is pursued, that fire can return. History has already shown us the cost. The question that remains is simple: did we learn enough to avoid paying it again?